Alright, hello everybody and welcome back to the final part of my Houses of Morrowind set review. So I apologize for the low energy on this one. I actually just realized tonight that the servers for the test server are going to be going down tomorrow. So I wanted to get this recorded before that happened, which means it's very late. I'm actually already in my pajamas, so going to be a pretty low energy one. But we'll get this review underway with the first agility card of the expansion we've talked about, which is Dress by 0 cost 1/1. Look at the top card of your deck. You may discard it. I don't think this is a particularly good card. I think this is a card for the future. I think this is something that potentially, if we see combo decks become more of a thing in this game, could be useful. But I think in 50 card decks, it's going to take a very powerful combo for that to be the case. Aside from fringe play, obviously, something in tournaments, combo decks, even if they're not particularly good on ladder, can find play in tournaments because they can just hard counter certain control lineups. But I think in this case it's just a little bit too weak. It's, again, very difficult to find a situation where this is worth a slot in your deck, helps you thin, and when something helps you thin, you always assume it's going to find a place eventually. I don't think it will be this expansion, but it's one to watch out for in the future. We'll call it 2 stars. Glass Greaves, this is going to be a 1-star card, not too much to talk about. This is a very, very low impact effect, so if you get this plot, you essentially get to play it for free, but I don't think you would play a 0 cost 1/1 item anyway, so I really just don't think this is even really worth mentioning. Really bad card, not something that's going to see any play. Moonsugar Smuggler, last gasp, gain 2 magicka this turn for a 1 cost 1/1. It's going to be another 1-star card. I don't see a situation where you need enough betray fodder where you would use this card versus something else that has a better effect. And I mean, it's a 1/1. It really just doesn't do anything. It's basically like the equivalent of being able to sacrifice a contract or something like that for betray, but it's just a very difficult situation that I see you wanting a card like this in your deck. It's just so low impact. It really doesn't do a whole lot, so not a big fan of this one. Again, another 1-star card. Morrowind Aspirant, 1 cost 2/1 slay, summon a copy of Morrowind Aspirant. This is going to be a 3-star card. I think this has a lot of potential. It's one of the better 1-drops we've really ever seen. But I think one of the issues you're going to find with it is this is going to fit pretty primarily in aggressive slay decks that run the 2-cost action that supports this. If you don't have that, it's going to be less than consistent to get this, and I don't think those decks are going to be that effective. I do think this will find some play in some other aggressive green decks. I don't think that's going to be super consistent, and I don't think this is going to be a very high power level card in those decks, but I think it will see a decent amount of play in maybe mid-range or aggressive green decks, which means I think I'm going to call this a 3-star. If we see more support for aggressive Slay archetypes, then possibly, but I think one of the issues with the Slay archetype as a whole is you're very much split between stuff like Pomerant Renegade and Falkreath Defiler, which are heavy value, and then stuff like this, which is just heavy early game board presence. So we'll see if that changes in the future, but for now, I think it's probably a 3-star card. Awakened Dreamer, 2 cost 2/3 at the end of your turn. If you have a creature with 5 or more power, Awakened Dreamer gains +1/+1. This is going to be a 4-star card, really solid card here. Most of the time this is not going to be triggering on turn 2, but I think it's reasonable to expect in something like a mid-scout, or really just a lot of different types of decks where you can get this to trigger with your 4-drop, and it is a 2/3 stat line, so most of the time it is going to survive until that point, and if it doesn't, it's just a 2 cost 2/3. This is one of the better 2 cost 2/3s to top deck because it instantly becomes a 3/4, instantly starts the fight in that way, and then we'll continue down the road. So I think just a very basic good card. It's going to be easier to trigger than it looks, and just a solid 2-drop is fine. Solid 2-drops are always going to find home somewhere. I think this is a solid 2-drop, so we'll call it 4. Deranged Corpus, 2 cost 0/1. Deranged Corpus has +5/+0 on your turn. I think these +5 power cards are actually reasonable to trigger to the point you would never, ever want this in your deck. This is a terrible card to have unless you have exactly those triggers and nothing else but those triggers. This is a very, very iffy card. I mean, you could say it's a 2 cost 5/1 and you start putting on the damage earlier, but it's so easy to deal with and you start giving your opponent cards before you've had a chance to get any sort of board presence. I don't think this is going to see any play. I'm going to call it a 1-star card. Morrowind Assassin, I'm going to call this one a 2-star card. This is a little bit lower than Morrowind Aspirant because I don't see a situation where this is going to see play outside of the Slate decks, and I don't think the Slate decks are going to be particularly good. getting a target is quite nice for those Slay decks, and it's going to add a lot of consistency to the Slay decks themselves. I just don't think it's going to be the best version of them. This is close to a 3-star card. It might make just various Slay archetypes become significantly better, but I think by itself, it's just not particularly good. It's not particularly impactful. It needs to be following up a 1-drop or another 2-drop. If you have the ring, say ring 2 into this on 2, that's very effective, but it requires very specific draws, I think, to be effective, and when you don't have them, it's not just really not good at all. So I'm going to call it a 2-star card. Could end up seeing a decent amount of play. I think people really like Slay decks, so I think regardless of power level, people are going to play this card, but I'm not a big fan. Silt Strider, 2-cost 0/4 Prophecy Guard. Summon, move a friendly creature to this lane. Not going to talk too much about this one. Really cool flavor, really funny. Everybody likes Silt Striders, but I'm going to call it a 1-star card. It's just not very good. It's just 2-cost 0/4 Prophecy. This is word wall without the positive effect and with Prophecy, and it costs 1 more, so I don't see this seeing any play. 2-cost 2/3 Surin Pawnbroker Plot. Put a random 0-cost card into your hand. Again, I'm going to call this one a 4-star card for the same reason as Awakened Dreamer. I think it's just a solid 2-drop. 2-drops that are solid will eventually see play. And again, this is the same thing as Awakened Dreamer in that this actually is totally fine. Not totally fine, but it's not the worst thing in the world to top deck compared to something like perhaps a Barrow Stalker. Because you do get some impact out of this. If you draw this late in the game, you get a chance to add a 0-cost card to your hand. One thing to consider about this that maybe drop it down to a 3 is that there are a lot of bad 0-cost cards in this expansion. The pool got very diluted. It used to be a very strong pool where most of the 0-cost cards were quite good. In this case, we've added a lot of not-so-good ones. I still think this is good enough. Probably one of the better plot cards, just because it's not really reliant on anything else, and it's low cost. It gives you another thing that activates your further plot, so just a really solid card. It's going to be a staple in anything that runs a decent amount of plot. I don't think plot is going to be very deck-specific. I think it's just going to be good plot cards and bad plot cards, so I'm not super concerned about that. It's just a solid 2-drop, 4 stars. Ashe Repressor, 3-cost 4/3. Summon if you have a creature with 5 power or more. Shackle an enemy creature. 3-cost 4/3 is a reasonable stat line. I would consider it a little bit below average, but it's not a huge deal. And I think this is very easy to meet because of those two things. We're going to call it 4 stars, especially considering you're looking at... Again, with the same thing as Awakened Dreamer, I think pretty frequently you can get your 4-drop to trigger this, although the fact that you can't do this on Summon when you have a 4-drop makes it a little bit weird. Maybe this is a reason why you run Deranged Corpus, although probably not, but this is very good tempo even if it's not coming down on 3, and if it does come down on 3, it's not exactly negative tempo, it's about neutral, because 3-cost 4/3 is reasonable. So a 3-cost, a 3-drop that's okay and holds its value into the later game, that's okay, we'll call it 4 stars. Blood Sacrament, 3-cost Betray, deal 2 damage to your opponent and gain 2 health. Gonna call it a 1-star. I will mention specifically Hexmage Assassin, which is a deck I very much love. This is a lot of burst in that because it triggers the action twice, so that's 4 damage from that, and then another 4 damage from the card itself. That's pretty crazy, but a lot of times... I don't know if it's Hexmage Assassin is necessarily going to be good enough. It makes me consider it, maybe put it up to a 2, but it's one specific deck comboed with one specific card, and in any other situation, it's absolutely terrible. So, 1-star card, moving on. Corner Club Gambler, 3-cost 4/3. Summon, you must discard a card. At the start of your turn, draw 2 cards, and Corner Club Gambler loses this ability. So this is, again, very flavorful. It's a gamble. It is a gamble. You discard a card and then you get 1 card advantage. Essentially, you draw 1 net. Cost from a 3-cost 4/3. It's a little bit more than drawing 1, I think, because you're getting rid of the least useful card in your hand, and that could be pretty good. So I'm going to call this one a 3-star card. I think this is a pretty solid card for aggressive lists. I think something like Goblins would very much like to run this, especially because that runs a lot of 0-cost cards. It is in green, so green is a lot of times going to be using Skulk. If you use Skulk in aggressive lists to tutor things like Firebrands, then you can take a low-impact card or just empty out your hand completely before you play Corner Club Gambler and get a very positive effect. One negative aspect of this is it sort of makes you feel seed field line control very quickly, but I think in a lot of cases it's not going to matter that much because you're going to be playing this in very aggressive lists. I think the downside might be a little bit too much because you could go down like -1 card. You could be like discarding a card with this if it gets removed. But I think it's just kind of it's probably going to hit a nice spot for aggressive decks to the point where we'll see at least a little bit of play. Gores, stablemaster, 3 cost 3/3 summon, +1/+1 and guard if you have an animal. Gonna call this one a 2-star card, just animal synergy card. I don't think the animal decks are going to be better, although we did get one of the best cards in the set is an animal, so that's something to keep in mind. But I think this is going to be one that sees very fringe play. I think I'm probably going to play this card more than anybody else because I love animal decks. At some point, animal will reach enough synergy that high power level cards like the Shadow Green Elder and Wild Beast Caller will push it over the edge. I don't think this is quite enough because we only had basically this and the animal we're going to talk about in a second in this set, but it is very solid, so I wouldn't be surprised to see some play. I don't think you're going to see the 2 drops in green move away from Mournhold Trader and Goblin Skulk, and if they don't do that, you're not going to consistently get this on 3, which makes it a little bit iffy. We'll call it a 2-star card. Something to watch out for in the future, though. Twin Lamps Console, 3 cost 2/4 plot, lethal, and guard. This is going to be a 3-star card. I think this is very nice in terms of power level. I think this is very good in terms of power level, but I very much struggle to find where it fits. Sanctuary, Pet, and Fighters Guild Recruit are both significantly better than this. And then if you look towards other classes, you have other options as well. You look at stuff like Scout. Scout now has access to the Ald Velothi Assassin. You look at stuff like Archer. You obviously have access to Elena Bennock, and there's only a certain number of lethals that you really need, especially a conditional lethal, which can be frustrating because a lot of times what these lethals are doing is plopping down in the field end on early turns and making people's lives really, really annoying. You can't do that with this card, which makes it a little bit difficult. That being said, we always need to kind of keep in mind, do not underestimate lethal cards because lethal cards find a place. This is such a powerful keyword, and there is so much synergy in the game for it that I feel like this is going to find a place somewhere, but when I look at deck lists right now, I don't know exactly where that is. I'll hedge my bets and call it a 3-star card. Cliff Strider, 4 cost 3/4. Charge, can't attack your opponent. At the end of your turn, if there are no enemy creatures in this lane, move Cliff Strider. Not a big fan of this card. This is a 1-star card. 4 cost 3/4 charge, can't attack your opponent. The rush aspect of it is quite good, but I think it pays way too much for this effect, and I think the end of your turn thing is sort of a neutral effect. It doesn't particularly matter. I just think this is very, very low impact. I don't see any scenario where you would want to run this card even in a control list because it is not survivable at all when you compare it to a lot of different other things you could be running at the 4 slot. 4 slot has a lot of just very, very strong control options, so I don't think Cliff Strider is going to make any of the lists. Unfortunate. We were looking for some of the cool Cliff cards once we saw Jube, which was revealed before either Cliff Strider or Cliff Hunter, and I think we're really disappointed. These are just not very good cards. Drain Blood, 4 cost, Betray action, give a creature -2/-2. Something to consider is Drain Vitality. Not that this is, it costs more than Drain Vitality, so it's bad. It's that we see how powerful the act of removing attack along with health is in a card like Drain Vitality, which is why I'm going to give this one a 3-star rating. I think a lot of people are underestimating how powerful this effect is going to be. Specifically, it goes through wards, and even if it doesn't kill a creature, you get a chance to basically neutralize it, or provide yourself value trades, set up leaf lurkers. There's a ton of synergy here. It's very, very strong action, I think. One of the problems I have with it is the spot it comes down on the curve. If you are playing this, you are almost always playing this in a slower deck. I don't know how frequently a slower deck will be able to get value out of this on turn 4, although I might be incorrect about that, and it might be better even than I'm telling you guys it is right now. I think it's very strong. I just think it might be a little bit too clunky in the early game. If I'm wrong about that, I think this might actually become a staple. I think these kinds of effects, the minus effects, are very, very good, and it's always something to keep an eye on. Nixhound, 4 cost 3/2. Prophecy, summon Shackle each enemy creature with less power than Nixhound. The fact that this is 3, we've seen a lot of these less power cards. The fact that this is 3 pushes it a little bit above that, and I'm going to give it 3 stars because of that. 2 attack is a very populated number in this game. You see A lot of 2-drops are 2-cost 2/3s, things like Barrowstalker, Dragentail Savior if played by itself, or even stuff like Orclan Captain. We have Ward Crafter, we also have Daggerfall Mage, we have Fighter's Guild Recruit, we have Sanctuary Pet, we have a lot of stuff that this is going to hit, and a lot of stuff that is very important that this hits. So I think it may find a place because of that. This also has Synergy and Rally decks, although I don't think you'll see a ton of it. Anti-Synergy a little bit because it's good with Rally, but then it also has Prophecy. It's not really anti-Synergy, but it's just something to keep in mind. I think 2 is a good number, so if we see metas populated with that amount of stuff, or if we see a situation where we have a tempo deck that wants a chance to add more prophecies to it, this might be good enough. This is essentially like take an extra Magicka and you have Mace of Encumbrance on a creature, and it has prophecy. So there's nothing really wrong with it. I think this is a very solid card. Gonna see a decent amount of play. I'm just not sure exactly where it fits, but it hits enough targets that I think it'll find play somewhere. Burn Clan, Night Stalker, 5-cost 5/3 guard, summons, secretly choose an enemy creature, last gasp, destroy the creature. So there's some mind games in here, but I think a little bit of this is an RNG effect, as brought up by Turquoise Link several times, and that a lot of times it's going to be 2 creatures. It's the same result, they will both kill the Burn Clan Night Stalker, so they kind of just, you pick one, and then your opponent has to randomly pick one and say, okay, this, and they might lose a creature for free. And that's a bit frustrating, but I think the power level on this card is quite high. I think it's obviously very vulnerable to silence, but it does come down a turn before Belligerent Giant might be coming down. It's also a control tool that is cheap, and I think that's important because we're moving into a situation where Namira's Shrine might become one of the more prevalent cards in the game for control lists, and this kind of synergizes with that. You can't really run Manticora or anything like that in this list, but a 5-cost card that has a delayed Manticora effect, I think that's fine. This is also hard removal in Scout. Scout has never really had hard removal before, so I think Scout and Assassin are both going to kind of tinker with this card, and I expect it to find a home in Scout. I'm going to call it 4 stars. I think there's a chance this ends up being too easily dealt with from the opponent's side to really do anything or really be consistently included in lists. But I do think it's very, very powerful, so I would expect to see this one a lot in Scout. Blighted Werebat, 5-cost 4/4 drain. At the end of your turn, if you have a creature with 5 or more power, deal 2 damage to your opponent. That 2 damage also has drain. I'm going to call this one 2 stars. I think it's solid in animal decks, but not in a whole lot else. It's just very easy to trigger, but even after you trigger, the effect is not very good. 5-cost 4/4 is a really, really bad stat line. You want a lot better than what this effect is giving you if you have a 5-cost 4/4 stat line. Example, something like Brynjolf. Brynjolf was a 5-cost 4/4 drain that had not quite. I think this effect is a little bit better, but it wasn't approaching playability. The 4 health is just really, really rough because it dies to too many things. So I think this is a 2-star card, and I don't expect it to see a ton of play. Fleeting Apparition, 5-cost action, betray, summon a random creature from your deck that costs 3 or less to a random lane, unsummon it at the end of the turn. I'm going to call this one 4, and there is. Oh, there, you can see it this time. There is a lot to parse on this one. Number one, you think of Altar decks, and I'm not personally thinking about that. I think Altar, obviously, it's pretty fantastic because you can get some synergy with it, but I don't think you need to play Altar to get good value out of this. I think a lot of the early cards in the game are summon effects. Excuse me. I think a lot of the early cards in the game are summon effects, and if you are running a lot of low-cost summon effects, then this is pretty fantastic, especially when you consider something like Word Wall, being able to tutor your Word Walls, being able to tutor Thieves Guild recruits, and getting double effect out of those, even if they're coming back to your hand, because there's a lot of cards on the early part of the curve that you don't play for the body. I really think there's going to be tons of experimentation with this card. There's going to be things we haven't thought about with this card because it is such an interesting effect. I am a big fan of this. I think it's going to see a good amount of play. It might be a little bit too slow because of how little it's doing, but if you can kind of work your deck in a way that makes this work, the effect is absurdly powerful. This could essentially be considered a 5-cost draw and play 2 cards in a lot of situations because you don't care if they stick on the board. So really interesting. Expected to see a lot of experimentation. Not sure exactly where it goes. Potentially Control Scout, potentially Control Assassin. Not 100% sure, but I do expect it to see play. Telvanni Oathman, 5 cost 4/4. If you have a blue card in play, draw a random action from your deck. If you have a purple card in play, summon a Risen Dead in each lane. I think this is a very solid card for Telvanni decks. I think this is another reason why Telvanni is going to be good. I'm going to call it 4 stars because I think this is one of the better Oathmans in that Telvanni class. I also think Telvanni as a class is going to be the strongest 3 color and the closest to having a viable meta deck. They will almost always include 3 Telvanni Oathmans in those lists, although some mid-range decks might cut them. I also think this is potentially playable in Control Assassin. Drawing a random action from your deck could potentially find you some really high value stuff, and even if it doesn't find you high value stuff, if it's not high value, generally in Assassin, it's high tempo. You look at stuff like Cruel Firebloom or Firebolt or Curse, stuff that helps you with tempo at that point in the game can be played on the same turn as Telvanni Oathman, so that's valuable as well. Do expect it to see probably no real play in Scout. I think the Risen Dead thing is a little bit iffy. If you want to have a lot of Betray cards in Scout, possibly, but I do expect to see this in Telvanni, which I think is going to be fairly good, and I expect to see it in Assassin. Naru Virion, 6 cost 6/6. Summon a 0/1 target with guard for your opponent in each lane. Friendly creatures have Slay, +1/+1, and lethal. So I think this is a very solid card because we have seen if Slay is going to work, it is specifically going to be in slower control-y decks that use some very powerful Slay effects, specifically Pomerant Renegade and Child of Hersine. Now, because I'm kind of considering this is only really going to be good in one deck, I'm only going to be giving it 3 stars, although I think it's fantastic in that deck. That deck is Slay Archer. Slay versions of Archer, Control Archer specifically, have been fairly good, and I think have been something that has sort of crept up on people after the Rage nerf is maybe a different way to play the Control Archer variant. Child of Hersine is a very high power level card. Pomerant Renegade is a reasonable power level card. This has synergy with both. Combine it with Brotherhood Sanctuary if you run enough targets. I think this is pretty dang good, just providing yourself targets without having to force yourself to run sort of a clunky card in Night Mother, and also attaching it to a 6/6 body, potentially giving yourself some extra buffs. The lethal could become relevant if you have Brotherhood Sanctuaries out, because the Slay is going to buff it to the point that it's difficult to trade into, then it gives lethal, it gets to double trade on things. Very impressed by this card in that specific deck. If that deck doesn't really make it, I don't know where you would play this. I think in mid-range green it's a little bit weird. I don't think you would play it there. I think in control green a lot of the times you wouldn't want it there either. So, interesting one. I'll call it 3 stars because I think it's going to be fantastic in Slay Archer, but maybe I'm incorrect for focusing on that one specific deck. Gentleman Jim Stacy, a very classy individual, 7 cost 5/4 with one of the best arts in the game, in my opinion. He looks like he's from colonial America. It's absolutely fantastic. Summon your opponent, chooses a card in their hand and gives it to you. This is just a really flavorful card, really fun, I think. I'm glad that it's not particularly good, because if this was a good effect, it's very frustrating to play against. This is a 2-star card. I should probably call it 1, but I want it to be at least playable so I could play around with it. It's so fun, just the idea of pairing this with blink effects and having your opponent give you stuff. There's been a lot of fun moments I've had in the test server with this card. I think this is something I'm going to include a lot in Control Scout, just to make Control Scout a little bit more fun, because this is just a really interesting card to play with. So I don't think it's going to be very good. It's probably in reality a 1-star card. I'll call it 2 because I think people are going to have so much fun experimenting with it that it's going to see more play than potentially it should. Maybe somebody will find a home for it because of that. So it's just really fun card. One of my favorite design cards of the set. Nixox. Let's take a look at that. 7 cost 5/5. Summon. Gain 6 magicka this turn. This is a 1 cost 5/5 that you can't play until turn 7. I think this card is completely insane. I think there's a lot of people who are mixed on it. I think this is fantastic, and it's one of the contenders for best card in the set. This is just insane tempo if you need it to be in a tempo or mid-range deck. You would run it aggro, and I don't think you would run it in aggro, but I think you would absolutely do it in any form of green mid-range, because those are generally tempo-oriented as well. It's a very versatile card in those situations. It can be run in altar decks, although I don't think that's the home for it. What I'm thinking about particularly is I'm thinking again about control moving towards Namira's Shrine variants, and I think this is absurd for that. I think this is insane for Namira's Shrine control as well as mid-range, because when you think about Namira's Shrine, you're thinking about playing low-cost cards to try and increase tempo, even though you're planning to go into the late game. This is a higher impact than pretty much everything else you're going to be playing in those Namira's Shrine decks, because it is able to fight on board. It's also going to keep the cycle rolling, allow you to play multiple cards a turn, allow you to kind of move through your deck quicker, and give you more control options. I think this just fits in essentially everything except for raw aggro. I don't see a reason not to run it. You have this is again one of the examples of the value of a card. Is this worth a card in my deck? Because I need something to pair with this, and I think it is. I think even though you can't play this until turn 7, I think it absolutely is. And one of the big reasons is that it is in green, because green is not necessarily the color where you are playing a 5-cost card you want to always slam on 5, or a 6-cost card you always want to slam on 6. Green is a color where you have stuff like Leaf Lurker, Shearpoint, and Cliff Racer, which you might not necessarily want to just slam down. You might need a target for them, you might need them to be situational. So those are already high-tempo cards. Add a 5/5 on top of that, and it's, I think, completely insane. So this is a 5-star card, one of the best cards in the set. This is one that looks very powerful. You think, maybe I'm missing something. I played with it. It felt very powerful. Maybe I'm still missing something, but this seems completely busted. And one of the most powerful cards in this set, and one of the most powerful cards in this game. Cliff Racer Onslaught. So this was my card. 9-cost. Action, summon a 4/4 Cliff Racer with charge in each lane. Your opponent summons a 0/1 target with guard in this lane, or in each lane. Very, very bad. 8-cost, essentially a 9-cost 8/8. If you're pairing it with another card, you can't release. Oh, you could say, well, pair it with Drain Vitality, then it's, oh, you're getting 8 damage out of 1 card. No, you're getting 8 damage out of 2 cards. You have to count the card you used to combo with this, because it could also be used to combo with a card that is not this, and a card that is not as bad as this card is. The target thing could potentially be good for Slay decks, but I think a lot of the Slay cards we've seen besides Naryu don't really care about late game. They have the 1-cost and the 2-cost are the big slays from this. I just don't think it's going to see any play. It's such a weird card, really fun flavor, but I wish it was better because it was my card, but I think this is a 1-star. I don't think this is going to see any play. Onto the endurance cards. Vardvark Experiment. 0-cost action, summon a 0/1 Vardvark in each lane. Not too much to say about this. It's a 1-star card. Very, very bad. Only really going to be played in Animal Scout as something that you pull from Skulks. Kind of funny. They're absolutely adorable when you get to play them in game, but it's kind of a meme card and nothing else. The only real combo is with Shadow Green Elder, and I don't think that's powerful enough to run what is essentially a dead card if you don't have Shadow Green Elder, so very, very low power level, but very, very funny 1-star. Old Velothi Assassin, 2-cost 1/2 Lethal Rally. This is going to be another 5-star card. This is busted. I like saying that word. I really like saying busted. This card is busted. 2-cost 1/2 Rally means this is a little bit of a snowball, but that's not why you're playing it. You're playing it for lethal in the colors of yellow, which generally don't get it unless they pair with green. So this is a little bit more synergy with that kind of stuff. But a lot of times you will find, if you're playing lethal cards, that people will run away from them, which is a very common thing. You play a Fighter's Guild Recruit if somebody doesn't have anything in the field lane. They're not going to play something in the field lane to contest that Fighter's Guild Recruit unless it has ward or something. In this case, if they run away, you get Rally. You get the chance to just continue attacking and getting continual value until they have to come back and fight your lethal creature. So this is something that can only really be countered by wards. It does get hard countered by wards, so I think it is a very powerful card, but one that is going to be very fair. But it's just generally very, very strong, very good in early... very good early drop in slower lists and control lists. I think you're going to see this a lot. Could potentially work its way into mid, although I'm not sure that's exactly where it goes. It depends if those mid-range decks want some sort of lethal effect and wouldn't otherwise have it. You see Fighters Guild Recruit's not usually seen in mid-range, so I don't know if it would be that different for this because of the rally. But I think you're going to see this a lot in slower purple decks, specifically Control Scout. I even tried this in Control Sorcerer and found it was very effective, so I think it's going to find a lot of different homes. Very powerful, 5 stars. Alma Lexie's Disciple, 2-cost 2/3 Exalt 2, heal all friendly creatures. Reasonable 2-drops in purple are not going to see play because purple has fantastic 2-drops. They have Barrow Stalker and Windkeep Spellsword. Those are always going to get played over this. I just don't think... I think the All-Velothi card is also going to be played over this in just about every scenario. I just don't think it's particularly strong. I'll call it 2 cards because it is heal all friendly creatures, so maybe there's a use for that I'm not seeing, but I just don't think there is. Caius' Machinations, 2-cost Betray action. Give the top 3 creatures of your deck +1/+1. Going to call this a 3-star card, itching towards a 2. First impressions for this card were that it was incredibly powerful, but in practice you kind of have to consider where you're playing this deck. If you're playing it in a slower list, a lot of times they don't care about having +1/+1 on their creatures because their creatures are always designed to do a specific thing that they can do without buffs. Although it's always nice to hit something like a giant bat with this. In general, you don't really need to do that to have effectiveness from those cards. And in aggressive lists, this is very, very low tempo. It's killing something on the board and spending 2 magicka, and more importantly, spending a card for the sake of buffing something that you won't draw to potentially 3 or 4 turns down the line, because there's top 3 creatures, not top 3 cards. If you have actions instead of creatures, it may be 3 or 4 turns until you get those cards, and then you have to spend the magicka to play them. Just a very, very slow card for aggressive decks. Not necessarily slow in general, but slow for the aggressive decks, which I think this effect would want the most. Also can't be directed, which is a big thing, so we'll call it 3 stars because it is, in essence, a 2 magicka 6/6, but it's very clunky. It's about as clunky as you could possibly have for a 2 magicka 6/6, so I think it's going to struggle to find a home. I think it's a powerful card that's going to struggle to find a home. Korra Clan Bloodkin, not going to talk about this too much. This is going to be a 2-star card. Probably should rate it as a 1, but I think there's a reasonable chance the stat line is just good enough. If Rally becomes good enough and if items become good enough, this is a really cool stat line and a desirable keyword. I think the most likely scenario is that this sees no play, but when you see Drain attached to a body that's tough to kill, you always think maybe there's a place for this. So we'll call it 2 stars. Kind of not too much else to talk about. Very simple card. Trespasser's Bane, 2-cost action, set a creature's power to 1. Weakness will set a creature's health to 1, doesn't see play. Lay down arms will set both to 1 for 4, doesn't see play. This won't see play. Not enough impact, not worth a card in your deck, just not very good. Not too much to talk about. 1 star. Ancestral Dead, 3-cost 2/4 skeleton, slay, summon a Risen Dead. We're going to see some more skeleton cards, and the fact that this Risen Dead, which is a 1/1 guard token that is also skeleton, is relevant for people who want to do Betray decks or potentially skeleton buffs, which we will see moving forward. But I don't think the power level on this is high enough. 3 drops in purple are completely and utterly broken. The 3-drop slot in purple is the most contested slot in the game. You have Young Mammoth, Haunting Spirit, and Dark Guardian, 3 of the best cards in the game. There's a lot of stuff that's really good in purple that never approaches playability because of how good those 3 cards are. I think this will be added to that list. It's a reasonable card. Skeleton decks might try it. I don't think skeleton decks are going to be good enough. They will be fun to try, and they might produce at least 1 or 2 effective decks. So we'll call this 2 stars, but I don't expect it to find a real home. On-Day Clan Sorcerer, 3-cost 4/3. At the end of your turn, if 3 or more creatures died this turn, put a random blood magic spell into your hand. I'm going to call this one a 3-star card. I think a lot of people consider this to be one of the most powerful cards in the set, and something that is going to become a staple, but we'll go back to the same thing with Risen Dead, is that purple currently has 3 of the best 3-drops in the game, and I understand the idea. 3-cost 4/3. That's not bad if you have to play it on curve. You don't intend to play this card on curve, but it's not bad if you have to. I disagree with that statement because instead of playing this card on curve, you could be playing a Haunting Spirit, a Young Mammoth, or a Dark Guardian. If you're not doing that, you probably want to be doing that instead of doing this. I think it's a very powerful effect, and I think it's harder to trigger than people realize, but it's still worth that effect when you get into the late game. I just think when you compare it to the other options in 3, even controlling lists would rather have one of those to potentially contest the board a lot better. This may force you to go into the shadow lane very early on in the game, which could be very difficult to come back from. Again, this is a very solidly power level card. It's just I don't know in purple, where you have so many good cards in that slot, whether this is going to be good enough to kind of push anything out, whether this is going to be good enough when you have the opportunity cost of running something else at that slot, even though this is only about this is about neutrally statted, this is not poor stats. I think there's just so many better cards you could be running in this spot. Not too much else to say about it. I gotta stop harping on the same thing over and over. But this is a really interesting card. I think it could end up being very powerful, but my current thought is it's not going to be quite good enough. Deranged Crescent, 3-cost weapon, +2/+2, slay +1/+1. Interesting for slay lists. Probably not even going to make those. It's a much worse version of Steel Scimitar, 1 star. Doral Mastermind, 3-cost 2/1 summon. Look at the top 2 cards of your deck, draw 1 and discard the other. I think purple control got a little bit better in this expansion with this card and a couple of others. So you'll see 2 color decks specifically that run purple will have some more options for draw. This could also find its way into things like vani. I'm going to call it a 4-star card, just standard, very good. It is a little bit overcosted because you can compare this to something like Thieves Guild Recruiter. You're paying 1 for that extra effect, but it's not a 1-to-1 comparison because you're also comparing purple to green. Purple's current best draw option is Enchanted Plate. I think you would rather run this over Enchanted Plate, especially in a control list. So I'm going to call this okay. I like that it's a 2/1 and not a 1/2 because 2 damage can be paired with things like Firebolt in a lot of cases, better than a 1 damage ping could be. So I think it's an effective card. Looks exactly like Hugo Weaving, which is hilarious. It looks like Elrond from Lord of the Rings, so that's kind of funny. So 4-star card, pretty effective. Just going to see play in a lot of different stuff. Not the most overly powerful card, but the fact that it's good draw in purple, it'll find somewhere. Knight of Nesis, 3-cost 2/3 rally, put a 2/2 Colovian Trooper with guard into your hand. I'm going to call this one a 2-star card. This is probably the one I changed my opinion on the most after playing with it. I think it's definitely reasonable, and I think it will see play in a decent amount of things, but the same thing is true about Undead Clan Sorcerer and Risen Dead, is you're playing this instead of a Haunting Spirit, a Young Mammoth, or a Dark Guardian, and I don't think you're ever going to want to do that. I think the fact that this gives you a 2/2 guard is better than people realize because it has synergy with Betray. This curves right into Rising Bones, which is nice. You get Rally, which is something that they have to deal with, but there's so many better 3-drop cards in purple, I just don't see it. It's the 4-cost and willpower thing with something like Pack Leader or Rift and Lawkeeper, where it's a very powerful card, but it's just such a contested slot that I don't think it ever makes it. Unfortunate for Knight of Nesis because I don't think this is a bad card. If this was in another color, I think it would see play, but I just don't think it's good enough to crack the list of 3s. Bonewalker Skeleton, 4-cost 1/2 Prophecy Guard, summon +1/+1 for each enemy creature in this lane. You would expect the average value of something like this, because you're taking damage, you would expect the minimum, if you get this off of Prophecy, is going to be a 4-cost 2/3, or 0-cost 2/3 rather, guard, and I think in most cases this is going to be essentially a 3/4 Prophecy Guard. If you want to consider it like that, I think it's very playable, and I think it's going to crack some lists, specifically in Scout, which has been lacking prophecies for quite a bit. Good Prophecy in purple, probably the best Prophecy in the set, probably the only playable, only very solid Prophecy, I would say, in the set. So I expected to see a decent amount of play. I'm going to call it 4 stars. Skeleton synergy is nice, but probably not super relevant. Just something that's going to be a pretty solid Prophecy inclusion in a lot of different lists. Caius Cosades, or Cosetus. I like Cosetus. That one's more fun to say. 4-cost 3/4 summon. Look at 2 of your opponent's cards. Guess the one that's in their hand. If you're right, give all creatures in your hand +1/+1. I just don't think this is a particularly powerful effect. I think it's one that looks a lot more flashy than it actually is. When you look at something like, generally this is hitting 2 or 3 creatures if you play it on curve, maybe even 3 or 4. If you play this in a slower list, you don't care so much about the buffs again. So looking at getting knowledge of your opponent's cards is quite nice, but and you can likely hit this with probably around 70% accuracy, as we saw with Thief of Dreams, but I just don't think the upside is worth enough. I think you're losing tempo by playing this. It's the same thing as Caius' Machinations, in that if you're playing this in aggressive list, you're losing tempo. If you're playing this in control list, you don't care so much about the buffs. It's just a weird combination of effects. I'm going to call it a 2-star card. I think it may find some place somewhere, but I'm just not super impressed by it. Mournhold Pilgrim, 4-cost 4/4 regenerate, exalt 3 +2/+2. Gonna call this a 2-star card. I think it's pretty fantastic in Arena, but I don't think it's gonna make any constructed lists. I think you compare this to something like a Bleak Coast Troll. Obviously, you could play both of them. This isn't replacing Bleak Coast Troll, but there's other drops in 4 that you may be wanting to play instead. This is similar to Preserver of the Root, and Preserver of the Root is something that has really fallen out of favor. People are kind of finding that it's not a particularly good card, and I think this is worse than Preserver, so I'm not expecting you to see a lot of play. You may play this in Exalt decks, but again, I don't expect Exalt decks to be a thing, so I'm going to go ahead and call this a 2-star card. Veteran Oathman, 4-cost 3/3. If you have a yellow card in play, double Veteran Oathman's health. If you have a red card in play, double the power. So this is one of the best receivers for rally buffs. I think this is a very simple card in that this will never see play in anything besides specifically the Veteran decks, which is going to be the rally decks. Most of the time, because every single tri-class card they have is related to rally. So I think you're going to see this played very consistently in those decks. I think you're going to... Wow, lighting just changed drastically. Interesting. I think you're going to see those played consistently in those decks and not in anything else. I think it's just very simple to evaluate from that standpoint. If that deck works, it'll be good. If it doesn't work, it'll be bad. I rated all the other veteran cards 4 stars. I think this is a little bit lower in power level, so we'll just call it a 3-star. I think this is very powerful in those decks if you can hit this with one buff, but a lot of times this is going to be pretty much just completely dead, and that's going to be very frustrating. So again, we'll call this a 3-star card. Could be really interesting to see. One of those cards that makes rally a little bit easier because it's another really good target for it that you don't have to do too much for, so interesting. Rising of Bones, 4-cost action, betray, summon a 3/3 Risen Horror with Guard. I'm going to call this one a 3-star. I think it's bordering on a 4-star card. I think it's very interesting and very powerful. I think, again, you're going to maybe have some difficulty triggering this consistently on 4. As you get later into the game, it will be easier to trigger, but it will also become less impactful to trigger. It is also very good in a skeleton deck. I think if skeleton decks work, it will be because of a card like this. I feel like it's going to find a home, even through that clunkiness. I feel like it's going to find a home somewhere, and it's going to be effective, because in reality, it is 4-cost 6/6, and that is very weird, and you do have to kind of sacrifice something, and it's divvied up in a way you wouldn't normally want. It's still a 4-cost 6/6. I think this is going to be probably a spell sword class card if you can find ways to make the board-wide buffs, specifically stuff like Divine Fervor, work effectively with this. This is a very powerful card. I'm going to be trying a lot with it, so I expected to see some play. Might be a little bit too clunky to kind of make it through, so we'll call it a 3-star card. Skeleton Champion, this is the second tribal lord for skeletons, the first being Bone Colossus. 4-cost 4/4, give other friendly skeletons +1/+1. The fact that Bone Colossus is also a card in the game means that this is going to have maybe a little bit more consistency than a lot of other tribals. You look at something like Goblins, where that is very reliant on tribal synergy, so it's a very swingy deck. Either it's a blowout or you can get blown out, and you see the win rate fluctuate pretty wildly because of that. I think skeletons are going to be more consistent, but less powerful overall. So I don't expect a skeleton deck to be particularly good, probably no higher than a tier 3 deck. Don't expect it to be that good, but this could be a 4-cost 5/5, could potentially be a 4-cost 5/5 if it comes down the turn after Dark Guardian. That has to be on curve, and you need to curve immediately off of Dark Guardian, so it's a little bit awkward in that scenario. I always hate relying on things like that. I am going to call it a 2-star card. I don't think it's good enough to push skeletons up into being an archetype, and I think it's probably not going to see play anywhere outside of that archetype, but it's nice to see, and we'll see if we get some more skeleton synergy moving down the line. Balisra War Rider, 5-cost 3/6 rally. I don't expect this to see a ton of play, but you always think rally combined with a high health total could potentially be very good. This may be a little bit too clunky. It is the exact sort of thing we've been looking at, where 4-cost 3/6 is totally reasonable. This is 5-cost 3/6. It's paying pretty much exactly 1 mana for rally, so it might be better than it appears on first look. I am going to give it 2 stars instead of 1 stars for that reason. I expect it to see no play, but we might be underestimating how powerful that rally effect is, and basically we might not know exactly how good just a reasonably statted creature is with rally, and this is an example of that. So we will see moving forward. I expected to see no play, but I will call it a 2-star. Betty Netch, a 5-cost 0/5. While Betty Netch is in play, your max magicka is increased by 2. This is a very funny meme card that we kind of joked around with Griffin during a review on my Twitch channel, but not considering it to be very good in any sort of sense. This is basically a slightly different version of his speaker with an increased magicka. It does have the benefit of curving into 8-cost creatures, which are generally very good creatures. So if this is in Warrior, it curves into Vigilant Giant. If this is in Scout, it curves into Baroness. I don't think it's going to be good enough. I think it's one of the worst cards in the expansion. We'll call it a 1-star. If it sees play, I think it's because it does curve exactly into those high power level 8 cards, but it makes you skip turn 5 to do so, so it's very awkward in that sense. Not a huge fan of it. Indomitable Ordinator, this is one that had a lot of contention on said Twitch review between a couple of people who thought it was mediocre, that would be myself and Dust, and a couple of people who thought it was fantastic, that would be Link and a couple other people. But I don't see the fuss about it. I think this is a 6-cost 5/5 Nahagleave in most scenarios. I don't think that's good. I think right now the control decks are Scout and Archer, and they don't care about a knock-leave type effect, and the aggro decks are running Spinner, Shadowfen, Sorcerer's Negation, and Belligerent Giant. So sort of fights against mid-range, but it's a 5/5, which is something that is very vulnerable to things like wards, getting traded up on. I don't know what actions you would usually use a 5/5 on besides Javelin, and Javelin doesn't find its way into anything besides yellow control, which isn't really currently a thing. So I just don't think it fits the meta right now. I don't think the power level is super high. I don't think the redundancy of having multiple knock-leave effects is going to be very good. That being said, all of that being said, 5-cost cards in purple are pretty freaking bad. So if you want to run a 5-cost card and there's nothing else that fits your game plan, this is reasonable. This is somewhat versatile, although I don't think the versatility means that much. Because of that, and only because of that, the exact opposite of these 3-cost cards we've seen in purple, I'm going to call it a 3-cost card because I think there's not a ton of better options currently at the 5 slot in purple. So we will say it might see some play because of that, or I will say it might see some play because of that, but I'm just not a huge fan of this card. I think it's decidedly mediocre. Odirnian Necromancer, 6-cost, 3/3 summon a creature from your discard pile with less power than Odirnian Necromancer. Again, less power, not less or equal, so you're looking at 2-cost cards unless this has been buffed. Has some synergy with Fervor, so look at something like Midrange Spellsword. Could be very good. Bringing back a Haunting Spirit would be pretty fantastic. You do get to choose which creature it is from the discard pile, so if a Daggerfall Mage has died, you get to go in and pick that Daggerfall Mage back out. So I think it's going to see play in some of those mid-range decks. It might be too slow for that mid-range deck, and I don't think this is going to see play in any control list, although in Scout it would be quite nice to bring back a word wall, so I'm actually kind of considering maybe this might be good enough in that as well. Even bringing back something like a Thieves Guild Recruit seems totally reasonable. If you can find consistent targets for it, I think it's a solid card. I think there's a couple different places it might find a home. For that reason, I'm going to call it 3, even though I don't know exactly where it goes. I think it's powerful enough that some people might find a use for it. Alma Lexie, 7-cost, 6/6, Exalt 3, +6/+6, so we're not going to call it a 7-cost, it's 10-cost, 12/12. Friendly exalted creatures are immune to damage. That includes Alma Lexie herself. So this is one that I think is the best when played outside of an exalt deck. 10-cost, 12/12, immune to damage. That's just a very solid card. Probably not good enough to be run in a lot of mid-range lists, but in slower lists where you can kind of get away with this, if you run 1 or 2 other exalts, you can find room for this. It's probably the most versatile of it because it's so good by itself. A lot of things this is susceptible to, specifically things like silence, bounce effects, and hard removal that make it very difficult to kind of consider playing a 10-cost card that could be so vulnerable to those things, but this might find a place in the meta where it becomes good enough just as that 12/12. And if we see a couple Exalt being played, even a minimal amount of Exalt cards being played, that minor synergy with those could push it up. So we're going to call this one a 3-star card. I think this one is just a very reasonable power level, not necessarily something that's going to be meta controlling, but just something that people are going to find a place for. Bloodline Outcast, 7-cost, 7/7. When a creature dies, Bloodline Outcast gains Drain this turn. If this were at 7-cost, 7/7 Drain, it would still probably be pretty bad. We're going to call it 1-star. Consider something like Night Shadow, which sees a little bit of play, but shouldn't because it's really, really bad. This is worse than that. Slower than that. Conditional. Not seeing any place for this. Solid in Arena, another Vampire, another Dawnbreaker target. Holy crap, Dawnbreaker is going to be insane after this expansion. It's just going to be an auto-include. But yeah, I'm not seeing a huge need for this card. Not seeing a huge place for this card. So, 1-star. Lich's Ascension. 7-cost, support. Your cards cost 0. You may play only 1 card per turn. Yeah. This is a 1-star card. I think this is going to be one of the worst cards in the game. I don't see any deck where this would work. This is literally 7 costs to do nothing because you can only play 1 card per turn. So if you're playing this on 7 to try and get full value out of the effect, you can't play any other cards in that turn. You play it and then you're done because that is the 1 card you played. And then even if you were playing 1 fantastic card every turn, there's not a lot of situations where playing 1 fantastic card every turn is going to get you there. I just don't understand I understand what kind of deck would be put in. It'd be the greediest deck known to man. But I think even in that, you'll find it's not going to be very good, because even in very greedy spellsword decks, a lot of times other control decks can just rush them down because they can only do one thing per turn. Being able to do one thing per turn is a great way to lose a game, so forcing yourself to only be able to do one thing a turn, I think is one of the worst things you could possibly do, even if it reduces the mana cost unless you play like a 12 mana card on turn 8. I don't think it's going to be remotely worth it. I think it's going to be one of the worst cards in the game. People experiment with it because it's very fun and memey, but it's very, very bad. 1 star. Mushroom Tower is going to be a 2-star card. I think this is an incredibly powerful effect, an absurdly powerful effect, one of the most powerful supports in the game for that effect alone, but this is, again, 9 costs to nothing. If you have another action to pair with it, it becomes a little bit better, but even those are generally going to be low-cost actions. There's not really anything for 3 or less that you're going to want, potentially Reverberating Strike or Crushing Blow, but nothing particularly good that you would be able to pair with this on the same turn, unless you're looking at ramp. Drain Vitality would be quite nice to pair with this, but at that point you've sort of gotten yourself stabilized anyway. It's just so absurdly slow, so vulnerable to support removal. Really interesting greed card. Again, this is one of the more interesting greed cards because it's not obvious that it's a greed card, because this is like sort of synergistic with removal, but this is a very high value card that is going to make people who don't run support removal just go in and put support removal in after they lose to it. I don't think it's a bad card. I think it's a fantastic card, but I just think it's way too slow. Just not going to be good enough to see a lot of play, because aggro does not care if you have this card. Midrange does not care if you have this card. And a lot of times, Control sees this card, they're just going to turn on the Jets. So, not a big fan of where this is going to fit into the meta. Really cool card, but I'm going to give it 2 stars. Last but not least, we're going to go through the neutral cards of the expansion. There's not too many of them because we just had a bunch of neutral cards in the Clockwork City expansion, so they dialed it back a little bit for this one. The first is Jube, as I affectionately call him, Jube. 1 cost 1/1 Slay, change it to Saint Jube, Eradicator of the Winged Menace. That is a 2 cost 5/5, or I believe it's 1 cost 5/5, that has immunity to Cliff Racers, Cliff Striders, and Cliff Hunters. So immunity to Cliff Racers because I don't expect the other 2 to see play. Basically, it's a 1 cost 1/1 that turns into a 5/5 if it kills something. You combine this with the Morrowind Assassin, the 2 cost 3/2. I think that's going to be okay. It's going to be a very high variance because this is a unique legendary that you need to have on 1 or 2 to potentially get full value out of them. Reasonable to trigger, but you need 2 specific cards in your opening hand, one of them being a unique legendary, and hard mulliganing for that, it sounds like a good way to lose the game. That being said, a 5/5 on turn 2 is pretty dang effective, especially when it can be paired with another 2-drop, so I see a place where this could potentially see play. I'm going to call it a 2-star card. Interesting, we'll see how people experiment with it and if they can figure out a way to make this consistently work, although even if they can, it's a unique legendary, and it's very frustrating. Hopefully, I kind of hope this card isn't going to be very good, because I think that's going to be very high variance if they just happen to have the unique legendary that is only good on turn 1. That's very frustrating, so we'll see. It'll be fun to experiment with, though. Mud Crab Merchant. This is another one I heavily differ with on people. I think a lot of people consider this to be a very good card. I probably couldn't disagree more. I'm going to say there's a few places where I think this card is going to be very effective. In Betray lists, getting another card to potentially give you to Betray. It's a 1 cost 1/3 that's effective in that scenario. And in potentially rally lists, because it holds buffs well as a 1/3 body, and it could give you another thing to rally to keep that train rolling. That out of the way, I think there's a lot of negatives with this card that people are overlooking. There's people that, specifically Link, I'll talk about here, that attest that this is basically a 1 cost 1/3 draw card, and I could not disagree more. I think this is just very, very card neutral. In terms of drawing a card, you do that because it either cycles you through your deck or it gives you card advantage on your opponent. In this case, it does neither. This is a 1 cost 1/3 that gives both players a card, and I think in most scenarios, it's going to show you 2 cards where you say, yeah, I can sort of use that one, and yeah, I can sort of use that one. And you're going to take one of them, and your opponent's going to get the other. Your opponent's going to look at it and say, yeah, I can sort of use that. Yes, there's going to be RNG moments where you get one really good card and like an Alduin or something that they literally can't play, and that's going to feel fantastic. Not for the other player, but it'll feel fantastic for you. But I think that's going to be inconsistent in terms of how much that happens. I also think people overrate how much a 1 cost 1/3 means. A lot of us came from Hearthstone. I've mentioned it quite a bit. A lot of us came from Hearthstone where 1 cost 1/3s are fantastic. There is a 1 cost 1/3 no text in Hearthstone that sees consistent play. The reason for that is because 1-drops are significantly better in Hearthstone. Hearthstone has a coin instead of a ring, which means they have 1 mana acceleration versus 2. That means consistently, even if you have a 2-drop, you're still playing a 1-cost card on 1. In this game, a lot of times when you have 2 and you have 1, you will just skip the 1 altogether, ring out to the 2-drop because the 2-drop is such a high power level, and you don't really limit your future turns because you have a couple more ring charges to use. In those situations, a 1-cost that doesn't fight anything except potentially a Wardcrafter, but even with Wardcrafter your opponent has the initiative, I just don't think this body provides a whole lot of value. I think it's a poor body that I would pay less than 0 mana for. I don't think I would play a 0 mana 1/3 neutral, no taxed. I don't think I would play that. And you add a card neutral effect to that. I don't think that makes it any better. I just don't find a lot of use for it. I think this is going to be a very RNG card, one that may potentially swing games, but I think consistently it's going to be below average, so I'm going to call this one a 2-star card. Dwemer Puzzle Box, 2 cost. Use is 3. Activate, discard the top card of your deck at last gasp, draw a card. Just heavy deck thinning for combo decks that don't exist in the game. Kind of funny if you want to run the Falkreath Defiler and just a whole bunch of crazy cards and try to just thin them off the top, and then Falkreath Defiler back and Odoving on turn 4. That's kind of funny. Not going to be practical. In the future, if combo decks become more of a thing, keep an eye on this one. Might actually be reasonable then. For now, it's a 1-star card. Stolen Pants. Oh my god. Even just doing the serious thing where I'm like introing the cards like, Stolen Pants? That makes me just kind of like, holy crap, I'm talking about pants right now. It's 2 cost 1/1. Summon a 0/1 Sheepish Dunmer in the other lane. It's an item. Last gasp, you equip the pants on Sheepish Dunmer. It doesn't go infinite, so it's not like that Sheepish Dunmer. If you have 2, you can go Sheepish Dunmer into Sheepish Dunmer and keep going back and forth infinitely. It doesn't work like that. It's just a one-time effect onto the token that it generates. So essentially, it's a 2 cost 0/1. Give +1/+1 to one of your other creatures. I think that's completely unplayable. I think a +1/+1 buff is worth less than 0. Again, you see +1/+1 in Breakthrough is not an item that doesn't see any play, so I think it's worth less than 0. 0/1 token is worth less than 0. Combine them, it doesn't equal 2. I'm not particularly seeing this card seeing any play. Completely hilarious. One of the funniest cards in the game, and is going to be one of the funniest things in the world to hit off of Merrick, because if you're looking for lethal and then you just hit a +1/+1 and then there's just an angry guy in the other lane now after you just missed your lethal because you got pants instead of an item, that's gonna be pretty dang hilarious. So I love that this card's in the game, but I don't think it's gonna see any play. I'll call it 1-star. Dismantle, 3 cost action, destroy an enemy support or a neutral creature. This only ever sees play if neutral creatures are very, very heavy in the meta. It kills a Parthenax, which is interesting to that, but Parthenax I would say Parthenax appears in probably 1 in every 20 games, even though your opponent's running it more than that, because usually it's a unique legendary, it takes longer. If neutral ever becomes bigger in the meta, this will see some play. For now, I don't think there's any situation, especially when we're getting almost no neutral cards into this expansion, that this is going to see any play at all, unless we see neutral cards that I don't expect to become huge in this expansion. I think this is just going to be a 1-star card, potentially something to watch out for as the meta develops, but I really just don't think this is very good at all. Silent Pilgrim, 3 cost 1/1, summon, draw a random multi-attribute card from your deck. So you compare this to the one earlier from purple, and I think it compares fairly favorably. I called that one a 4-star, I'll call this one a 3-star. Basically it reads as 3 cost 1/1, draw a good card from your deck, because if there is a multi-attribute card in your deck, it's probably a good card. It's probably one you want. It's still a 3 cost 1/1, I like 2/1 better than 1/1 very much in terms of trying to trade into things because of how well it pairs with other removal. But this is basically 3 cost, draw a good card from your deck. And once again, multi-attribute cards, not just triple. So if you run triple class, you can also pull dual class cards. For example, if you run Tribunal, you could draw something like a Sorcerer's Negation instead of Archcannon Sirioni. It might just be too slow, the fact that it's 3 cost 1/1 draw card that is just so little impact for the act of drawing a card. Might be too slow to find its place anywhere, but I have to think there's going to be some situation where at least one of the dual color or tricolor decks wants to rely heavily on that card. So I think it will see play in that. We're going to jump ahead, actually. We're going to just quickly... We're not going to finish off with this one, because that's completely boring. This one it's unplayable. It's a 1-star card. This isn't going to be the last one, even though it's the last for mana cost. 1-star card. Let's talk about the cool ones. So there's 2 very, very cool neutrals in this set, and we're going to finish off by talking about those 2. Yagrum Begarn. 3 cost 2/4 Dwemer. This is a Dwemer himself. Summon, draw a Dwemer from your discard pile and give it +2/+2. So really, really solid card. I think this is something that could see a decent amount of play. There's 2 potential things for this. Number 1, you can loop him with himself. A combination with Galen, you could put this in something like a Control Scout and loop him with himself. The other part of that is trying to find the minimum number of Dwemer. I think if you have 6 Dwemer, you can find a way to put this guy in your deck. Stronghold Eradicator is a Dwemer that sees a lot of play. Reflective Automaton is a Dwemer that sees a lot of play. Neither of those cards specifically are in the same deck. I think in some cases you'll find a way to find that extra 4th, 5th, 6th Dwemer to put into your deck to make this guy worth it. I don't think it's something you change your deck around, but if incidentally you happen to be running enough, you will add this card because it's a very high power level card. I think it will find a home somewhere. Not sure exactly where that is, but I think it's good enough to find home somewhere. We'll call it a 3-star card. And last but absolutely not least, one of the most fun cards I think we've seen, Unite the Houses. 3 cost action. If you have at least 1 card of each attribute in play, you win the game. It's just very simple. It just kind of does it incidentally. It's like, oh yeah, you win the game. It's fun. It's really bad. I've experimented a decent amount with this card, and I think other streamers have as well, relying on the RNG cards to do this, especially when you essentially need the total sum to be less than 9 so you can play this in the same turn, or else it's vulnerable to removal. It does count items, it does count supports, but if you want to make this easier on yourself and run triple attribute classes, you're also running 75 card decks, so it's harder to filter through to find those generation cards. Stuff like Mudcrab Merchant, stuff like Battle Mage's Onslaught, stuff like Moment of Clarity and Revealing the Unseen. Not actually so much Revealing the Unseen, but Moment of Clarity. Plunder is another good example. There's a decent number of cards that can generate it, but none of them are consistent enough. There's a few cards, there's a card in yellow that generates purple and red, and that's something that could be used, but it costs 7. I'm talking about Jarl Balgruuf. Maybe there's something I'm overlooking, but in all of my experimentation and anybody who I talk to, this is just really, really bad card, but it's amazing. It is super fun to try and do, and the fact that it's bad is the reason I love this card. If this card was good, I would hate that there was an RNG reliant deck that was competitive. I don't think this is remotely competitive. I think it's a 1-star card, but it's hilarious. It's fantastic. I love this card. I'm happy they printed it. It's going to be super fun trying to experiment ways to make this work and failing at pretty much every single one of them. So that's it, guys. That is the end of my Morrowind review. Initially, I was thinking at the end of this review, I would take a second and talk about what the best cards I think from the expansion are. But I don't think I really need to do that. I think I've kind of gone over it. I didn't rate a lot of cards 5 stars, and I tried to explain the ones that I did in a very thorough way, and I hope you guys understand sort of where my opinions come from. There are 150 cards in this set, so if you were upset by some of the ratings, for example, if you're upset by the fact that I rated a lot of cards low, keep in mind, number 1, there's a ton of cards in this set, so even if there's a ton of bad cards in this set, there's still going to be some really good cards that shake up the meta. And number 2, nobody is ever going to see 149 cards and be right about every single one of them. There's going to be things that I'm wrong about. It's not something you can get around. It's the thing that's inherently built into doing a pre-release set review. But I hope to give you guys at least an idea of where these cards might see play, where you could potentially find a way to fit them, why they might be good, why they might be bad, and why you might want to try and experiment with some things that maybe necessarily don't look that good from first glance. So really fun. I've had a ton of fun on the test release server. The 3 color classes, I think, in general, are not going to see... well, they will see a ton of play. I don't think they're going to be very high power level, but it was a significant amount of fun to just go in and try to experiment with them. So I think that's going to be something a lot of people are going to enjoy at this expansion. I think you guys are going to love this. I think even though I think we'll sort of come back to a similar meta that we are at right now. I think the experience the next couple months you guys are going to have experimenting with these cards and trying to figure out the way to use them is just the best part about card games. So I look forward to it. I hope I'm wrong about some of the cards I called bad, because I want every card to be good and fun, because I love this game. I love getting to experiment. So thank you guys for watching. Really, thank you guys for watching. Expect some Morrowind content coming up. Expect me to come back and look back on this review in a little bit, but I'm going to stop talking because I've been going for about an hour and a half recording this, and I'm about to fall asleep. So thanks again for watching. I will see you guys for Morrowind content coming in the very near future.